going on, everyone, and welcome back to another week at the homestead. So we're still trucking along at the basement, or at the Beige Bungalow and the basement renovation. Well, I guess that's not actually true. By the time this airs, that renovation will be over. But anyways, so I just wanted to take a minute to talk to you guys while I unload the trailer. So in this week's episode, I want to tackle how I went about building the built-in Billy bookcases. So all of this footage bounces around over about a 4-week span because as we were building the built-ins, other things needed to get done before we could continue on with the built-ins. For example, we needed to finish out the feature wall before we could finish out some of the trim work. The flooring needed to go in before we could put on the baseboards. So this really is kind of like a montage of the last 4 weeks worth of work or so, with focus entirely on how I went about building the built-in bookshelves. So with that, we might as well dive on in, and we'll pick right up where I started doing all the framing for the bulkhead above the built-ins, as well as the walls on each side of the built-ins themselves. Alright, with the bulkhead done above the bookcase, so the built-in bookcase over there, it's time to go ahead and build the walls. There we go. So, while we're waiting for the mud to dry on our corner beads, we might as well get to framing the bottom of our built-in. And what that's gonna do is just raise it up a little bit off the ground. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna frame a little bit of a base out of 2x4s to lift our billies up around 3 inches. So we'll go ahead and cut our pieces to length on our miter saw, and then rip them down using the table saw to our final height of 2 7/8 inches. When you're building any type of built-in like this, make sure to add a cross piece to your base unit. At any point, you're going to have 2 different bookshelves meeting. This just helps make it easier to level them out when you're installing. So we'll just take this random 2x4 for now, and we'll just assume it's the top of one of our walls. So what we're going to do is we'll bump it into the top of our finished bulkhead. That'll be something like that. And you'll notice that there's a gap right about here. What that's going to allow us to do is bump our MDF directly into the bottom of the finished bulkhead. That way it starts giving us that custom built-in look. From there, to hide that seam of the MDF hitting the drywall, we can take something like a quarter round and wrap the entire top of the bookshelf, and that'll give it that custom built-in look that we're after. As you're installing the walls and base of your built-in unit, make sure to continually check that everything is level and plumb. This will make your life a lot easier as you go to install the MDF along the sides or any of the trim work, knowing that you've maintained a nice square, level, plumb unit all the way along. So the final step in the framing portion of this build is to check and make sure that the walls are square to each other. And to do this, I take measurements from corner to corner in both directions. If these measurements come out the same, or at least very close, you know that your entire unit is square. Alright, so finally we can move on to actually assembling the billies themselves and getting them rough fit into place. So as I'm editing this video, I realized you probably don't want to sit there and watch me build 2 more billies, so let's just zip on through that really quick. By the way, that's over there. That's my lovely wife. Say hi. Rough fit worked out pretty well, so all of our measurements were good, even though we didn't have the billies here, but looks good for this stage. So when you're screwing your units together, make sure you pick a screw long enough to push through the first one and into the second side, but not so long that you screw through both. So one of the tricks I always like to do is now add a couple screws from the other side, so going from the middle into this way, in the middle gaps of both the top and the bottom. And that way you're pulling both sides together evenly. All we need to do now is go ahead and repeat the same process for the third bookshelf. So I went ahead and measured the framed wall downstairs on the side of the built-in. Now we're going to cut our piece of MDF and scribe it essentially to that exact square. In order to do that, I'm going to use a track or a guide for my circular saw. Now I don't have a plunge cut saw or a track saw. I just use my regular circular saw, and I made this guide very easy. I'll put you a link in the description that shows you how I made it. So let's go ahead and measure it out and make the cuts. Once all of my MDF trim work or framing was all complete around the built-in billies, I went ahead and filled any of my gaps with just standard drywall putty, let that dry, and then sanded it down. So you can see a few of the white splotches here and there, and that's exactly what that's from. Once I was happy with all of my filled gaps and nail holes, I could go ahead and start painting the actual built-in itself. One of the things I would suggest is to paint the framework around any of your built-ins the same color as the rest of the trim work in the basement, or for whatever room you're working in for that matter. So this means paint that the same color as your baseboards or the trim around the doors, and this will just help give a nice cohesive look to the space. So one of the final steps in really giving that built-in look is to finish out the trim work around the top and the bottom. So in this case I went with an inside quarter round around the top and just standard baseboards around the bottom. From there I could fill in any of my joints and nail holes with some drywall putty and give everything a light sand. Then just give a final coat of paint to all the new trim work and everything is complete. So let's dive on in and take a look at how everything finished up.